This is Popular Front, a podcast focused on the niche details of modern warfare and underreported conflict with me, Jake Hanrahan. Today we're speaking to analyst and writer Hassan Hassan. He's going to be speaking about the re-emergence of ISIS in Iraq and Syria. Now, you might have seen for a while, every time there's some kind of ISIS clash somewhere in the deserts of Syria or around Mosul or wherever in Iraq, people say, right, ISIS are back, ISIS are back. That wasn't exactly the case, but now things are definitely looking like they are gaining steam again. They never went away, despite what Trump said, despite what various world leaders are saying. Sure, they lost their territory, they lost Raqqa, Mosul, and then, finished off in Baghouz, but actually a lot of ISIS fighters got away. So Hassan Hassan is going to be speaking to us about that. And do consider supporting us at patreon.com/popularfront. So there's a lot of people have been saying for a while now, like ISIS are on their way back, and it didn't really look like that was the case for a while. It was kind of sporadic attacks, but now, you've just written this report and it looks like actually they are kind of trying to make a comeback. Maybe you can talk to us about that. What are they up to?
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. They are on their way back. They're not there yet, which is kind of a subtle mix between recovery, insurgency, resurgence of the ISIS insurgency in the past few months, but it's not there yet. I think it's still recent, a trend, and they're still trying to come back. And obviously, they benefited from a series. We can talk about all the different developments that happened since October last year. So, in this report, what I tried to do is to go methodically back to the end of the physical caliphate in March last year and trace how they were actually weakened for the best part of last year, and what are the signs of that weakness. I gave an example, for example, in Iraq, an operation or a series of operations, multi-phase campaign conducted by the United States and the US-led coalition, the Iraqis, to conduct attacks against ISIS in areas that the Americans thought ISIS still exists, in rural areas, remote areas in Iraq and the borders between Iraq and Syria. And the campaign was called the Will of Victory. And I think it was a massive success, and ISIS was kept under pressure until things started to kind of move differently.
Right, and what have they actually been doing? I think, what was it, last week or maybe even this week, I've lost track, but they were doing attacks quite recently, weren't they? There was a big shootout, I think, in Iraq and in Syria.
Yeah, this was all recent. Actually, just April. Since April, they've conducted some large-scale coordinated attacks in some parts of Syria and some parts of Iraq. Specifically, the border areas between Iraq and Syria and what we call the Badia or the Syrian desert. So that these are the areas from the countryside of Homs, the desert areas around Palmyra, all the way to the Iraqi-Syrian border. It's a vast area. This is usually an area that is controlled mostly, for the most part, by Hezbollah, by Iranian proxies in that region, as well as obviously the Syrian regime and Russia, with a small pocket of U.S. forces in that area, between Iraq and Syria and Jordan, and then in central eastern Iraq, so from north of Samarra to Diyala, and mostly in Salahuddin and Diyala and Kirkuk.
So who are these new ISIS fighters? Well, not new, but who are they? Guys that didn't go to Baghouz and they managed to set up elsewhere, or are they guys that escaped from Baghouz? And who are they? Do we have any idea?
Well, the Iraqis like to call them in Syria as well the remnants of ISIS. So these are the leftovers from the caliphate and people who who made it out of the caliphate, either went to remote abandoned villages in Iraq or the desert areas in Syria, or went underground as sleeper cells, and now they found a new opportunity to kind of come back, start to conduct some attacks here and there But these attacks have been consistent, kind of the low-level sort of attacks that we saw for the past year or two, 2 in Iraq, 1 year in Syria after the defeat of the Caliphate, were the usual insurgency tactics like ambushes, assassinations, targeted killings, hit-and-run attacks, extortion. This kind of tactics that they use were in kind of spaces and in places where the Iraqis and Americans cannot all the time trace them. So this is always kind of work in progress when it comes to the U.S.-led campaign against ISIS, and nobody really believed that they will have a complete success in the sense that they eradicate the organization. But something interesting was happening, which is if you trace play by play how ISIS was weakened after the territorial the collapse of the territorial caliphate of the organization. That was in and of itself a massive, obviously, defeat of the organization. But then there was a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of cutting disrupting their networks, going after their leaders, their remnants, and so on and so forth. And there was really steady progress, in my opinion, despite the attacks here and there. In some areas, actually, ISIS go into new places, and attacking, especially outside Iraq and Syria. That continued, and you could see, even though that ISIS internal structures, in my opinion, remained intact for the most part, despite the killing of Baghdadi, despite the killing of senior commanders throughout the years, they continue to be able to their remote affiliates in places like in North Africa and Afghanistan and elsewhere, and they kept them basically under their control. And that was, again, in and of itself, a massive success for ISIS. So you always have this balance of ISIS weakening, but at the same time, its internal structures remaining, lurking, waiting for the right moment to jump back in and bounce back.
How have they kept those structures intact when so many of them are dead and so many of the seniors have gone?
It's all lessons learned. Obviously, ISIS has been in this, for a long time in Iraq and Syria, but mostly Iraq, and they've experienced some of the same events that happened to them over the past 5 years. So the killings, the decapitation of basically the elimination of their top leadership, the killing of their mid-level commanders, but also the loss of territory, the attempts to come back. So they're basically learning from the same playbook that enabled them to come back after 2008. And I always, obviously this is kind of in jihadism study, it's well known, so there's nothing new there. But back in 2008, when there was a conversation between basically the top leader at the time, or the leader of the organization, Abu Umar al-Baghdadi, speaking to his war minister, Abu Hamza al-Muhajir, telling him, after they lost Fallujah and then they lost Mosul, they said, Abu Umar al-Baghdadi spoke to his war minister and said, we can no longer stand and fight in Iraq for more than 15 minutes, so we have to change the way we operate. Because previously, they operated as a regular jihadi organization, hitting street to street, fighting suicide operations and so on and so forth in Iraq, and at the height of the civil war and the Iraq war before that. So now they found themselves in a profoundly hostile environment where even the Sunni militants who used to work alongside them turned against them. And that was a profound defeat for the organization, much more profound than the current defeat they faced, or the defeat they faced a year ago in Iraq and Syria. That meant that they had very little manpower. They were disrupted, their internal structures were weakened, and years later, after 2008, specifically in 2010, they lost the top leader, Abu Umar al-Baghdadi, and his war minister. And now, basically, they had these years to learn how to come back and live and survive this hostile environment. So to them, this is not really the worst that ever happened to them. And they learned from the lessons, and they kept their internal structures because they knew and anticipated that this is what's going to happen to them at some point.
Right, and is the new leader, I forget his name, but is he really calling the shots, do you think, or is it people around him that are keeping this together?
Yeah, so we don't know much about the new leader, Abu Ibrahim. There are speculations in Iraq that he's the same one that was suspected to be the next leader after Baghdadi died, or would die at the time before, Abdullah Qardash or Hajj Abdullah, who's also from Tel Afar, which is kind of a Turkmen-dominated or Turkmen majority town in the north of Iraq, where dozens of ISIS fighters and mid-level commanders, but also top leaders hailed from that town. So if we judge the organization, or if he's the same kind of leader as Abu Bakr Baghdadi, then it's yes and no. Yes, in the sense that everything that the organization does is supervised by the leader. He can't do everything, so it's not kind of day-to-day organization and organizational kind of decisions, but he pretty much has a hands-on approach to the organization.
Right, and how are they existing? Because they're all splintered apart now, you know. There's no Raqqa, there's no general command base or anything like that. There's no Mosul for them anymore. How are they managing to communicate and do these increasingly violent attacks, even though they're basically on the run?
So this is an interesting question, something to kind of observe, because if you look at the timeline has been short since the collapse of the organization to now. You can pretty much see how the organization survives, what causes the organization to survive, what feeds the organization, how it thrives. Because when we were surprised by ISIS, the world surprised, not us, people who watched the Syrian and Iraqi conflicts, by the rise of ISIS in 2014, a lot of people started asking questions. Where did this organization come from, what it wants, and so on and so forth. And many people kind of started to focus on the ideology. They went and read books or spoke to some people or watched some videos and tried to kind of explain the appeal of the organization. And obviously, it takes so many different things factors for an organization like that to capture 1/3 of Iraq and almost half of Syria in almost no time, right? At the time. But you can pretty much kind of now, after 5 years or 6 years, start to understand, if you follow events on the ground today and see how ISIS is bringing itself back from the defeat from the bottom and try to crawl back into the peak again, from the valley to the peak, from the bottom to the highs of Iraq and Syria. And you can see that's all one thing, which is a security vacuum. The security vacuum that exists in both Iraq and Syria today is what's enabling ISIS to move around, operate in parts of Iraq and Syria, and slowly you can see that gap is opening wider and wider, almost by every month, despite the fact that ISIS, and especially after that kind of weakening started to be reversed, the weakness of ISIS over the past year, and how ISIS survived that weakness and started there were a series of openings that enabled ISIS to rise again, to raise its head again, essentially. So you can see why I think the security vacuum exists, but at the same time, the Americans and the Iraqis and everyone was trying to keep the pressure, so ISIS doesn't exploit that vacuum quite well. Now, there are other factors that come in my opinion, later on, and how ISIS exploits that security vacuum. It might be grievances. It might be problems in Iraq and Syria. It might be the conflicts and the political stagnation that dominated the Iraqi political landscape since October until 2 days ago when they formed a new government. So all these factors enable ISIS to, start, moving its head a little bit, kind of raising its head and moving a little bit. And when, and this is one final point on that, is that when ISIS starts to be seen as coming back, the intimidation comes back immediately with it. So that means people on the ground in parts of Iraq and Syria start to be scared that ISIS might come back. And that means vengeance, retribution, and so on and so forth is something they would consider if they want to cooperate with the Iraqi government. They have to now think twice, 3 times, and even more, many times before they start to cooperate with the Iraqi government against any signs that ISIS is back in these areas. And consequently, by extension, once ISIS start to intimidate people, its mobility and visibility becomes even more, and so on and so forth. That's how kind of slowly and gradually it comes back.
Yeah. And how are they operating? Are they getting support from sympathizers? Are they blending in with the locals? Because I'm just thinking, like, these guys have been doing some bigger attacks, and they need the weapons, and they need to, provide whatever they need for the fighters. How are they managing to do that when they're, such a close eye is on them?
Sure. I mean, obviously they're not starting from scratch. They had weapons. Some reports I heard from the ground is that ISIS has something called, I forgot the Arabic word now at the moment, but basically kind of to spot kind of geolocation of certain weapons they buried in different parts of Iraq and Syria. And they have database essentially to kind of, obviously within a narrow circle of the organization where they hide their weapons. Now, this is not surprising because if you lived like I did in those parts of Iraq and Syria specifically in my case, burying weapons when there are campaigns by the government to disarm the population, so on and so forth, is kind of a tradition. So people know how to bury weapons, how to hide them when there's a campaign, and how to find them later on, even if it takes them like 10 years and so on and so forth to go back to it. Obviously, it will be sometimes rusty, but it still works. I've seen these things happening before. So what ISIS does is, obviously, it has a lot of money that's saved from the time of the caliphate. Remember the time they made tens of millions of dollars, and now a lot of this money is still with them, but they don't have to spend the same amount of money as they did before when they moved in large convoys of to fight and so on and so forth. So basically, they have the money, they have the weapons, and they have the people they can recruit to do things. Well, the tactics are really kind of there's a long list of tactics they use, including using part-timers to conduct certain operations. These part-timers, they might conduct one operation a year or two. It depends. Or it's just it's almost like a mafia. You just do one favor to the organization, and that's it. You probably save one member of your family, and so on and so forth, right? So these things happen, and kind of one by one, they demonstrate that they back, and once they back, they can awaken some of their sleeper cells that remain sleeping all these years, and this is how it works. So they are moving. It's easy. We have some work we're going to publish soon also about how their smuggling networks along the borders of Iraq and Syria are actually kind of thriving now. They're back to being able to kind of move across borders, despite the control, the militias controlling the Iraqi-Syrian borders. There's increased activities in villages and towns and parts of Iraq and Syria. These movements are not always violent, so ISIS moving around, speaking to people, sending messages, and so on and so forth. This is something that we've started to see in recent months.
Are they getting new recruits, would you say? Have you seen any evidence of that, or is it just the ones that were already there?
No, I don't think so. I don't think ISIS, because they have small numbers and they benefit now from small numbers. You can discern these things from obviously speaking to these people, speaking to people on the ground, and also listening to reading and listening to ISIS. For example, when they formed their organization in Syria, Jabhat al-Nusra, there was an extensive interview with the leader of Julani. At the time, he was operating under the norms of ISIS, despite the ideology being a bit divergent from ISIS. But he was operating as a kind of led by Baghdadi at the time, and his tactics included recruiting not higher numbers. They didn't actually want higher numbers, and he said high numbers are sometimes a liability. So what they focus on, quality attacks in different parts of Iraq and Syria to show that they are operating in an expansive area, even though sometimes these same attacks are conducted by some of the same groups.
Right. I know it's hard to say, but if you had to estimate how many ISIS fighters that are currently active do you think are left in Iraq and Syria right now?
So the estimates now from the UN and something that the Iraqis seem to agree on, which is 18,000 to 20,000 ISIS fighters in both Iraq and Syria. Now, this sounds a lot, but I think it's very close if and only if you count all elements of their networks, not just the fighters, not just the people who are members of the organization, people who are part of the network that they rely on. So that would be, like I said, people part-time people who conduct certain operations for them. They're not necessarily part of the organization. Also, sleepers, and this is kind of back to your point of getting new recruits. Sometimes it's really going back to the same contacts that you had before and using them again as an organization. So these people might be, they believe in the organization. They might be members or not, but they still operate as part of the operation of the organization. When ISIS took over parts of Iraq and Syria, the caliphate was not just ISIS. As in the membership was also people that ISIS compelled to work with them. And that's why you saw massive numbers of people. And once that core of the caliphate, the ISIS organization itself, collapsed, you started to see the numbers shrinking all of a sudden, and start to see that the numbers are not actually that many or that big. So they have contacts, and they're using them. And as they become more and more visible, the list of people, the pool of people they can rely on, becomes bigger and bigger.
Right. Most of their filmmakers are either dead or in prison now, or their equipment's gone or whatever. So we're not seeing the big, glossy kind of releases that they used to do before. These horrible things where they're torturing people and blah, blah. But they are still releasing media, right? Like quite often.
So according to our fellow, Dr. Hassan Hassan, for example, he is one of the best, if not the best, ISIS observer on Iraq. And his findings one of the findings that they are using media and they are using some of the technology, but it comes now with low quality and the small size of the media itself, the media product they produce. And that's because they don't want to basically transfer media in a kind of a sophisticated way where they have to use certain websites or certain media, or they have to move it around. So what they use, smaller size and it's kind of an easy to upload, and because they feel like they can't do the same work they did before. So their quality is actually clearly worse, poorer than before, but they still, film through mobiles and cameras and so on and so forth. So it's still almost the same, but not the same quality. And obviously not the same intensity. Things like, in the past where you saw like ISIS producing a movie, or almost a movie, like when there's action, drama, or they burn someone, and that kind of atrocious footage. Now, what they do is really focus on just documenting how many people they killed. That's really the biggest focus in their videos.
Right, and other than that, when they're not saying, yeah, we've killed this many people, blah, blah, what are they saying? Like, what's their message now to people that, are still interested, I guess?
Well, their message is clear, is that they're still relevant, they're still deadly, and they are more active than before, than, say, several months ago. And this is significant, for example, if you take Syria, as example. Recently, the forces that fight the Assad regime actively are not the usual Syrian rebels. The most active are really groups like very loyal to Al-Qaeda or ISIS. Yeah. And ISIS wants to tell everyone in Syria that they are the ones, they are truly fighting Assad, and they are committed to this fight. And they're going back now, and one of the observations that we had was basically that they're trying to organize. They were trying to emphasize the kind of attacks and kind of targets they have these days. So they're focused their attacks on Shia militias in places like Deir ez-Zor, from Deir ez-Zor all the way to Homs. That kind of ungoverned or undergoverned space in the desert areas. And next are the Kurds, and then people who work with the Kurds and with the Syrian regime. So they're becoming more focused, it seems, on the kind of targets that they think most Syrians would like to see being targeted. And that means the Assad regime, the Iranian forces, and to a lesser degree, or far lesser degree, Kurdish forces in eastern Syria.
You're from Deir ez-Zor, right?
That's right.
Yeah, and there seems to be a lot of activity around there. I keep seeing these SDF posts where they're saying, like, yeah, they've sent in these special forces, and the Americans still seem to be there. How realistic is it that that is kind of a hotbed? Is that true?
Yes, I think so. So, first of all, these attacks never went away completely. So ISIS always attacked in different parts of the territory that they once controlled. It fluctuated, but like at low levels, low intensity attacks rather than kind of large scale and coordinated. But Deir ez-Zor is very interesting because if you go back to the early days of the Syrian conflict, Deir ez-Zor was one of the earliest provinces to be mostly liberated, quote unquote, by the rebels, kind of when they expelled the Assad regime from these areas. And jihadists had a presence in Deir ez-Zor, but that presence was never dominant at the height of their power there. Jabhat al-Nusra controlled almost like 3 towns, like maximum 3 towns, 2 or 3 towns, that where they were dominated, but they were not in control of the whole towns, of these specific 3 towns. Which is kind of an interesting point to make, because if you trace that and see that Deir ez-Zor never was a hotbed for jihadism, even at the height of the power of Jabhat al-Nusra. Jabhat al-Nusra one time was the biggest, had the kind of the most powerful branch for itself in Syria in Deir ez-Zor, rather than in the north or in the south. It sort of had three branches at one point in 2013 or 2012. But its biggest was in Deir ez-Zor. But despite that fact, they were not as dominant in Deir ez-Zor. So the dominant forces were the rebel forces. Now, when ISIS took over, seized these massive areas in both Iraq and Syria, Deir ez-Zor had to be captured not from within, but from through intense fighting from outside. So until ISIS took over Deir ez-Zor, it had never been able to establish a grassroots level for grassroots support for itself on the local level in Iraq, in Deir ez-Zor, but it had to basically come after it took over Mosul with massive guns and massive weapons, and had to defeat the rebel forces in Deir ez-Zor and expel them by force. And only after that they started to kind of recruit some people. There's a big lesson there that this Deir ez-Zor, this province that had never had local and grassroots level support for an organization, became later the last area to be recaptured by the U.S.-led coalition from ISIS. And ISIS fought till the end there, and fought hard there. And I think there's a whole book that can be written essentially on just Deir ez-Zor and how an organization can become a menace despite the grassroots support.
It's quite a tribal area as well, isn't it?
It is, and the vacuum, again, is the key word here. Deir ez-Zor was, even when the rebel forces controlled most of it, never really got the attention from the Syrian opposition and the world as a kind of a center for the opposition, because they were focused on Aleppo, Damascus, Daraa, Homs. These are the capitals of their revolution. Deir ez-Zor was remote. They used it for kind of making money. So Jaish al-Islam had a branch there to make money and then focus on Damascus. Ahrar Sham, the same thing. Jabhat al-Nusra, the same thing. So I think negligence, and obviously the geography. The Syrian regime was in control of Hasaka next door. Was in control of the city of Deir ez-Zor. So the province, which is the rebel-controlled areas in the province, were mostly rural areas, the tribal areas that you're talking about. And on the other side, Iraq was controlled by the Iraqi government, so the vacuum helped ISIS to kind of, when it came back, didn't have that local resistance, especially after the rebels were expelled, and after that kind of locals were left alone, essentially.
Yeah. So what level do you think the ISIS comeback is going to get to? Do you think that we'll start seeing actual towns taken over and held for a short time, as we did when ISIS first started rolling over places in Syria and Iraq? Or do you think it's just going to stick to these kind of guerrilla tactics, but obviously growing?
So if you asked me that question several months ago, I would say ISIS is far from being back, and it won't be back anytime soon. Over the past 2 months, I think the likelihood of ISIS becoming a true menace and threat to both Iraq and Syria is exponentially more greater than several months ago. What I mean by that is really it depends. What I mean by that is ISIS has the potential now to become in control of massive areas, not massive as in like all of Iraq and Syria, but significant areas in Iraq and Syria. I don't think they will do that. I don't think ISIS now, even if it can, will attempt to take over areas and stay in control of them. This is not the limits and the limitations of them, and they know that this is not the right time for them to do that. They learned from some of the lessons of the Caliphate. They haven't abandoned their attempts to control territory, but it's at this phase they're focused almost exclusively on insurgency tactics. So by the end of this year, and this is my argument, if the current trends continue till the end of the year, I think ISIS will become almost irreversible. ISIS gains would become almost irreversible without much deeper engagement and involvement by the US-led coalition. So they had to basically go back on the ground and fight ISIS back. Remember, just a few months ago, after the killing of the Iranian general Qasem Soleimani, the American, with the tension of with the Iraqi forces, but also because of other reasons before that, they had to withdraw from very important bases in western Iraq and central Iraq, near Qayyar and all the way to Anbar. They had to withdraw abandon these bases and focus, especially in bases they cannot defend very well. So the bases are not well defended, and they retreated into some bases that were more significant, but also better protected. So the involvement is becoming less likely, but ISIS rise is becoming more likely at the same time. And this tension essentially leads me to think that ISIS will continue to come back and will continue to rise, to go back to the beginning on the way back, but it really depends on whether the Iraqis will resolve their tension, resolve their problems with the Americans, and invite the Americans back to kind of become more involved in the areas where ISIS is becoming more active recently. So I think that's kind of the dilemma that Iraq faces today. In Syria, we have a similar situation where, after October, when Donald Trump announced that the Americans would leave Syria, and he did that abruptly and without any plan, that caused a lot of confusion in eastern Syria that led the Kurds to run to the Russians and the Assad regime to prevent the Turks from invading Syria. Remember, after the Donald Trump's decision into Syria. So the chaos, essentially, or the confusion that happened after that also opened doors for ISIS and created new gaps, new problems. The Americans had to basically reverse their decision, but they still lost some of the areas to the Russians and the Assad regime, and they became more concentrated on the border areas from Kamashli all the way to Tanf, mostly really Abu Kamal, and then part of Tanf. So all these things are making it harder for the engagement that we had seen before October 2019.
Wow, so that was almost a gift to them. What about the Russians? Where do they stand in all this? What have they said anything about what they're doing about the possible return of ISIS? I don't really keep track of what they've got to say, to be honest.
So for the Russians and the Assad regime, ISIS is not the biggest problem. Also because ISIS is not really that active in areas controlled by the Assad regime. The only areas that ISIS kind of fights and has these occasional clashes with the Assad regime is that area around Palmyra, which what we call the Homs countryside, or the Syrian desert. And that's where Iranian militias operate, not really the Assad regime, but mostly the Iranian, the Assad regime is present there, but mostly Iranian forces. So Russia is focused almost exclusively on regime-held areas, meaning the areas secured by the Assad regime, on the economic problems, on managing these political fallouts that are happening every now and then, but also trying to steer the Assad regime's steer the Assad regime into kind of a direction that Russia thinks is the best way to secure the Syrian regime. And in addition to that, obviously, the second focus of Russia is managing the relationship with Turkey in the northwest of Syria. It's back and forth between the two countries, but recently they agreed on a ceasefire, and that's more permanent than previous ones, at least. I think analytically, I think it seems like it has a a longer shelf life than previous ones, because the areas reached very close to areas that Turkey views as immensely strategic and critical for its fight against the Kurds, but also to secure its borders.
Yeah. And lastly, what do you think? I mean, I know it's not really up to you to decide, but I mean, you've done all this work and everything on it. What do you think needs to be done to actually stop this re-emergence of ISIS?
Yeah, see, that's a question. It's an easy question, but hard at the same time. Easy in the sense that you just stay in Syria and Iraq as a U.S.-led coalition. Make sure that ISIS continues to be kept dead and kept under pressure until there's a political settlement at some point. And I think over the past few years, the Kurdish-led forces in eastern Syria had an opportunity to basically create local structures away from the Assad regime. I think the lives of people there are better off. People are better off than places controlled by the Assad regime in eastern Syria. I'm not talking about Damascus and elsewhere, but in the areas that have seen conflict before. That's the only way. I'm in support of kind of supporting this idea of decentralized governance and staying there until that there's a political settlement with Damascus. So it's not a fraction of Syria or partition of Syria. It's not a fracture of Syria or partition of Syria. It's really just helping the locals to fill that security vacuum on the ground and making sure that there are local forces in control of these areas. It's a hard question at the same time because I know the political realities in places like Washington, London, elsewhere are not conducive. They're not in support of something like this.
Yeah, unfortunately. Hassan, is there anything else you want to say before we wrap this up?
No, I think we said we kind of spoke about everything. Just the idea that I think the next few months are very critical for ISIS. There is so much happening in both Iraq and Syria, eclipsed by the coronavirus. But I think there's some interesting trends happening on the ground.
Definitely. Thank you very much, mate. Where can people read your report and follow your work?
So I work for the Center for Global Policy, so cgpolicy.org and Twitter.
What's your Twitter?
X Hassan.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, mate. Appreciate that. Thanks, man.
Thank you for having me.
That was Hassan speaking about the possible re-emergence of ISIS in Iraq and Syria. Definitely check out his work. He's very interesting. Got a lot of good analysis on the situation out there. If you like what we're doing, please do consider supporting us on patreon.com/popularfront. For £5 a month, well, $5 a month, you get bonus episodes. For $10, you get access to the community Discord, narrated articles, all sorts of stuff. Patreon.com/popularfront. Thank you very much to all the patrons keeping us going. The more we get on Patreon, the more Popular Front there is. Like, no one is out here buying fucking fancy stuff. It's all going back in. You're seeing there's documentaries, all sorts. Thank you to our sponsors. This episode was sponsored by defensepost.com, defense with an S. Go there for regular updates on the world in conflict. Also sponsored by Oracle Coffee Shop in Portland, Oregon, USA. They're an independent coffee shop selling only fair trade products. Go and see them at 3875 Southwest Bond Avenue, 97239. Tell them Popular Front sent you. They will be reopening when all this coronavirus shit has passed, or has at least got a little bit better. The episode is also sponsored by Black Triangle, an independent company manufacturing their own low-key self-defense tools. Go and check them out on Instagram at Black Triangle Group, or their website blktriangle.com. Tell them Popular Front sent you. They might nice, you might get a discount, something like that. The episode's also sponsored by our mates at Fengtings. Go to instagram.com/feng.tings, TINGZ, or Z if you're an American. They do custom Baofeng radio sets. They do like customization with you can get like camouflage Baofeng. You get extra antennas, cattail antenna, big battery, all sorts. Also a lot of education in terms of how to use the Baofeng, how to use low frequency radio stuff. I got one, it's cool, it's very interesting. Feng.Tingz, Tingz. Follow us on Instagram at popular.front, or me at Jake_Hanrahan, Hanrahan. It's the same on Twitter, Jake_Hanrahan. Our Twitter for Popular Front is at popularfrontco. Couldn't get any other fucking username, so there you go. It's the same as the website, popularfront.co. That's basically the landing page. You'll see everything there, podcast episodes, all the articles. If you go to popularfront.shop, you can get our merchandise, support us that way. To us on YouTube, youtube.com/popularfront, or just go to popularfront.tv. So thank you very much to the following Patreons. Without you, this would not be possible. They are Adam Bergsnyder, Amy Rupert, Andrew Hurley, Anthony Kabarak, Axel Iverson, Azad, Bill Wilson, BREN86. If you want a name in there, just make sure you put it on on the Patreon. Brian McLaughlin, Trey Nance, Chad Walker, Charlie, Chris, Christina Rivetti, Christopher Martin, Clayton Tanner, DR, Dan Dunham, Daniel Shearer, Degenerate Zero Alpha, Diana Gorvanek, Don Wayne, Emiliano, Emily Molly, Fletcher Tate, Fragile Feeling, Frank Austin, Hugo Newski. Again, if I've said that wrong, please do let me know. James from the Discord, Joanne Stocker from the Defense Post, Josh, Jungle King Birapan, Lawrence Abrams, Liam Williams, Louis Nicastro, Maxwell Burke, Maurice Zumwal, Ari, Olin Thorne, Patrick Bronte, Peter McCormick from What Bitcoin Did and Defiance, Q-Ball, Rubicon, Ryan Sandercock, thank you, been with us from the very start, Scartoon Music, Sebastian from the Discord, Surishe Hawazi, Stephen Davila, Tony Bin and Vida Provost, thank you very much. Like I said, if you want to support us on the Patreon, patreon.com/popularfront. If you're on the $30 tier, please do feel free to suggest people as much as you like. I mean, anyone can suggest, but they're the ones that will, always get looked at first. And if you want to change your name on the Patreon, if you're on the 30 tier and you want to get the your name changed on the call out, do let me know, or just change it on the Patreon. So that's that, yeah. But yeah, thank you very much. Patreon.com/popularfront, keep us going. Or if you don't like Patreon, go to popularfront.co/support. Music in this episode, the intro was by Home and the outro is by Sam Black, aka Son of Old. Go and listen to his music at samblackpf.com and tell him to upload more stuff from the Popular Front podcast to his SoundCloud if you want.